Hey, how are you? Good. What's the purpose of it?
Very small.
I like the other. It's a ticket. I'm not sure that the chair has
Bring like a pillow.
just make sure our chair can't go up.
Well, let's, looks like we've got a quorum here. I think let's get started. All right. Well, thanks, Lynn. I'm assuming you brought the cookies. You're awesome.
Thank you, Lynn.
Yeah, thanks for bringing those. And thanks everybody for coming today. It looks like we got a full house here. Number of people online as well. And just looking at our agenda, we got some updates at the top end here of the meeting from water quality and from state lands. And then some of the key areas that we want to talk about is just how we calculate salinity, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that's important and how we think we might be able to do this. But that really fits into a lot of the different discussions that are ongoing around the lake right now, and I think it's important that we come up with a method that we can all agree to. So Christine's been doing a lot of work over the last month, 2 months, years, in trying to understand this, get her arms around it, and I think has some great ideas here. She'll share here today. Are there any other key things that you didn't see on the agenda that we need to make sure we cover today? I think our next meeting is scheduled for June. Doesn't mean we can't meet again before then, but I guess keep that in mind as in our conversation today. In terms of what issues we see that are coming up on the horizon, and we want these meetings to be fruitful and useful for everybody, and so we don't want to meet too often, but we also want to make sure we stay ahead of the issues and decisions that we can make. Before we jump in, let's do things around the room, and then I'll read the names online. I'm Jeff DenBleyker with Jacobs.
Christine Rumsey, US Geological Survey.
Brine Cooperative. Bill Brown, Brine Cooperative. Jake Alexander, Forestry, State Lands.
Integratives, Friends, Great Salt Lake.
Andrew Rupp, Geological Survey. John Lott, Wildlife Resources. Regular Water Resource, Utah Water Resources.
Mark Reynolds, US Magnesium. Then Stireman, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
Jennifer Biggs, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. Emily Holly, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
Ryan Doherty, Cargill Salt.
Harris, Water Quality. Kyle Stone, Wildlife Resources.
Jessica Bowman, Wildlife Resources.
Travis Anderson, Morton Salt.
Angela Golf, Forestry, Fire, and State Lands.
Scott Neely, USGS. Justin Nickel, Morton Salt.
Ryan Rowland, USGS.
Great. And then online, we have quite a few people as well. I see Aspen Johnson with Commissioner's Office, Bonnie Baxter at Westminster University. Craig's here twice. Elliot Jagnicki with UGS, Georgie Corkery with Westminster University, Jake Alexander, he's here too. And let's see, Joe Havasey with Compass, Leanna Littlerwolf with Water Quality, Layla Mahdi with Water Resources, Rob Dubuque with Friends, Tim Hawks with the Brine Cooperative, and Bill Johnson, University of Utah. think we have everybody there. So I guess first order of business, we sent out a copy of the meeting summary from our January meeting. Wanted to see if there were any comments on that or any changes that we should make. If not, I'm happy to entertain a motion to approve. So Thomas, oh, sorry, I didn't see the hands raised. And seconded, I saw Andrew and Craig. Great. All those in favor of approving them as is, say aye. Aye. And opposed? Nay. Hearing none, we'll finalize those summaries and they're approved. So thank you for that. I guess the next thing on our agenda here is just our update on the lake. I want to thank Christine and Ryan for they've been doing this for years. So I think it's always super helpful.
Okay, Brian's gonna start us out.
Okay, so I'll talk about lake elevation and discharge, and then Christine will take over on salinity discussions. Next slide. Okay, as of March 18th, the daily value at this gauge on the south arm, that's the old Saltair location, was 4193.5. So we're up about 1.4 feet since the seasonal low in November. And then it's similarly for the north arm. I mean, the north arm elevation is about 9/10 of a foot less than the south arm, but currently we're at about 4192.6 feet. And on the north arm, we're up about 1.2 feet since the seasonal low. So that's really good. And then just an update on the major surface water inflow gauges. So this is the Bear River Corinne. On the y-axis is cumulative stream flow in millions of acre feet. And on the x-axis, we're showing a water year. Blue line obviously is the highest ever measured cumulative flow. The orange line is the lowest measured. The green zone is the 75th to 25th percentile, and the light gray line in the middle of the green zone is the median. The black line are this water year's data. And currently you can see we're a little bit below the median of the 50th percentile. So that's the Bear River near Corinne. This is the Weaver River near Plain City, same plot definitions, and you can see the bold black line is creeping, down there along the 25th percentile, so below the median at this site so far this year. Next is the Goggin Drain. Same type of plot, obviously. The bold black line here is flirting with the 75th percentile, the top of the green range, so higher than what we usually see. Higher than the median. Next. And then, so wrapping up with the Great Salt Lake Farmington Bay outflow gauge, the bold black line is above the gray line, above the median. So good news, right? A little bit above the median at this site. So that's kind of our four major surface water inflow gauges. As you know, we measure discharge at the new breach. This plot is, you saw this plot last time. It's got data from January 2024 out to the current period. The blue line are continuous discharge data that were computed from the stage discharge rating that was active during that period. We ran into backwater effects as the lake levels. We didn't have as good a free fall over the new berm, so we started getting backwater effects at this site, making the rating unusable. And so, but we continue to do these monthly measurements of discharge at that site. And so the most recent measurements going back to January of this year, 1,080 flowing from south to north, and then a little bit of flow going from north to south, flowing underneath that north to south flow at the surface. February 6th, 1,010 CFS flowing south to north, and about 37 CFS flowing north to south. February 21st, 1,100 CFS going south to north, and about 29 CFS going north to south. And then very, very recently, 1,200 CFS flowing from south to north with about 40 CFS flowing north to south. So, 1,000 CFS roughly, and a very minor amount flowing from north to south over these last several months. We also have a gauge at the lakeside breach at the far west end of the railroad causeway. So this is daily discharge on the y-axis. Negative values represent north to south flow. Positive values represent south to north flow. This plot starts on October 1st, 2024 and runs out to the current period. You can see the blue line, the measured discharge from the rating. We're at 0, no flow at this site until recently, February and March. We're seeing very clear signals for flow from north to south. So the Newfoundland Basin has received some precip and it's draining, and we're seeing that at this gauge. It's very difficult for us to quantify these flows, these north to south flows accurately. I've touched on that before in these meetings, but they were just out there yesterday. And they measured 107 CFS flowing from north to south at this site. So that's verified, yeah.
So that's not North Arm Brine, it's Newfoundland Basin water. So yeah, I think okay.
Yep. January, we started seeing the signal for that north to south flow. They measured 4.8 CFS. So for right now, this index velocity rating, we have a velocity sensor that's up looking. We have a stage sensor. This index velocity rating that we have right now is picking up this north to south flow. Things change out there, it's really dynamic, so it comes and goes. But for right now, we're picking it up with this rating. So that's good. That's good news. This is still a problem. We discussed this last meeting. Our north arm lake elevation sensor that's close to the new breach, it collapsed. The piling that was on collapsed in August. And we just cannot find a company that will, well, what do we got to do to replace this piling? A barge with a pile driver on it, get that barge mobilized out to the north arm to drive a piling. Very, very expensive. So we've talked to at least one vendor, potentially two, but the bottom line is this is super expensive to try and do. It's going to be 6 figures probably at a minimum. And so now we're looking at a different method, potentially taking a track hoe out there. And I'm just going to put this out here. This is just a brainstorming idea. A track hoe to build a little bit of a spit into the north, pound the piling using an attachment to the track hoe, and then the track hoe backs up, removes the spit that it excavated to get out, and go do that to get a piling in. The piling is by far the most optimal way to measure surface water elevation accurately. It's in theory not going to move a lot. Other options are not good, like a non-submersible pressure transducer, which just means it's a pressure sensor basically. Then you have density issues, and anyway, we'd really like to do piling. Or we just bag this and wait until we build a new firm structure is built at the new breach and try to design in at that time a measurement infrastructure for a lake elevation gauge close to the new breach.
Hey, I'll put in a T-post for 20,000.
Yeah.
I can affirm that John drives a mean T-post.
So we've reached out to some contractors about this idea to use a track hoe. And so I'll let you know what the numbers look like on that, hopefully next meeting. Next slide. Okay, look, thanks to our cooperators, including the Bureau of Rec most recently for a bunch of new gauges. We have 9 new gauges installed in the Great Salt Lake Basin so far. Those gauges that are installed have a red check mark, so you can read through the list. It's got a red check mark. That gauge is in. There's several gauges yet to install, but we're really close. Salt Creek near Crystal Hot Springs, Malad River near Bear River City, Willard Bay at the A.B. Watkins outflow is going to be a thing, going to be gauged, and then the Salt Lake City Sewage Canal, which is it's going to be a significant inflow to Great Salt Lake. So those are the 4 sites yet to do. The Salt Lake Field Office has been hammering this really hard. I'm really, really proud of them. I can't say enough. So 9 of the 13 gauges are in. 4 left to go, and we're really close on getting these last 4 in. And this agreement was signed in July of 2024. So this, you got to get the permits, acquire the equipment, etc. This is a really good timeline that they've accomplished here. Next slide. And the data for the new gauge, the 9 that are already in, we've already developed stage discharge ratings. That took an immense amount of extra work to get that done. Many of these are index velocity sites, but they watched the stage data really closely after they got them in. When they saw fluctuations in stage, they were running out to get discharge measurements to develop that rating. So stage, near real-time stage and discharge, that should be ARE, are now available for all sites that have been installed on the National Water Dashboard. And you can kind of see the new, on the National Water Dashboard, when you go to the dashboard, it defaults to showing how the current stream flow compares to the historic record. So if it's got a green infill, the current stream flow is within the 25th to 75th percentile range. Since most of these are brand new, there's no historic record to compare to. They just have a white infill on there. And that just means from the legend that the current flow is not ranked. We have to have 10 years of record to start ranking the flows. So that data is now available, and we hope to get those last 4 gauges online soon. I think that's it. Yep.
Great.
That's it for me. Any questions for me?
Thank you.
Great, we'll just hop into salinity now. So here is a plot showing salinity in grams per liter on the y-axis from about October of 2022, our historic low-ish to present, for our 4 monitoring sites in the South Arm where samples are collected by Great Salt Lake program. Our most recent shallow salinities range from about 108 grams per liter to 116 grams per liter. What was really cool about this time is that the lowest we measured was actually in Carrington Bay at our site 2565. Usually that happens at our 2267 site. The inflow sites at, where the Bear comes in Farmington, the outflow comes in at 2267 and 2767 are around 112 grams per liter. And relative to last November, when we had our seasonal high salinity, we were down 8 grams per liter. That's from our site in Gilbert Bay at 3510 and down 10 grams per liter at 2565. So salinities are dropping as lake levels come up. And then if we just look at these salinities in the context of our record over the last 15 years or so, you see we're kind of hovering around periods where we've been in 2017, 2019, also 2011. And I'll just throw out a couple of other measurements we have at New Breach from February 21st. Was 116 grams per liter, and Exxon's hair on March 10th was 105 grams per liter. And I forgot to mention this, but these most recent salinities that we measured were from February 27th. So that's kind of where we're sitting right now. And maybe I'll just save the rest for next discussion. Jeff.
Any questions? I think yesterday, Jordan Clayton at the Water Users Association workshop talked about the hydrology coming into the lake and indicated that his forecast was 4193.8 for the South Arm. That's the median, and there's a probability that goes above and beyond that, below that. But that's, I think he was estimating another 460,000 acre feet of inflow to the lake this spring based on snowpack and testing water levels in reservoirs. So we'll see. I talked to him afterwards and he said they're still learning. This is only the 2nd year he's done this. So, but one of his questions was, is it helpful? I'm like, I think knowing the volumes is helpful. It's just having an idea of where the water levels might be in the coming summers. It's good to know or have an idea of where they might be. So, any questions for Brian or Christine? If not, Jim, do you want to give an update on the rulemaking?
I'll be brief. We have submitted our rule thanks to everyone who, from this group and other folks who contributed to workshopping it with us over the last many months. It's at OAR currently, and they're doing their review. We're going to have our, because of the timing of our submission, we're going to have our board officially approve its submission for publication next week at our board meeting on Wednesday, the 26th. And then April 1st, it will go into a public comment period for 30 days, after which in May we'll compile and respond to all the comments, and then ideally publish it. It'll become effective at our next board meeting if everything goes well, in May, late May. So that's kind of the updated timeline. Some of our next steps that we're working on will be to refine and build on our guidance document that we also issued with it. I guess to that end, I think we discussed in our work group that we would continue the work group. But obviously, I'll reach out to this whole group to see who would like to participate in the development of that guidance document further. And probably send another doodle poll later this week or tomorrow, or the early next week. That's kind of the update of where we're sitting.
Great. Any questions or comments on that? You had a lot of great participation.
Yeah, it was very helpful for us because to anticipate. Right, that's the challenge with rulemaking, is trying to anticipate what would come up and how you would address every scenario. So
They went through a number of iterations.
yes, a lot of definitional changes that hopefully work out well.
Great, well, thank you. Ben?
Yep.
Have an update?
I think probably our most frequent update is the hot topic grants are open now, and they're open until April 4th. So if anybody has any very good research proposals, please submit them. We've just to kind of reiterate, we've made a few big changes. We are allowing now multi-year grants, which we've never done before. And then also we upped the initial grant amounts. And then we are really focused and weighing heavily on projects or proposals that will influence our understanding of the lake, that will help, or excuse me, improve our understanding of the lake in a way that will actually help us manage it better. So we really want to make sure that the researchers or folks submitting proposals are articulating how they think that'll affect our management. Because what's research if it doesn't help us improve the way we understand and manage the lake? So that's one of our biggest updates. Jeff, I know we have the CMP on here, so I'll hunt for a minute on that, or maybe touch on my thoughts on that after I'm done here. But I didn't see anywhere on here where we were going to discuss the berm analysis. Is this a good time, or did you have a spot you were going to?
No, this is great.
So we did get the berm analysis back from Jacobs. I'll share that with this body, so everybody gets a copy of that. Jacobs did add in some analysis on the blocks and some different alternatives, as we kind of discussed last time. But I think that maybe the biggest update on that is that things kind of from the time that we got this funding last year till now, funding has changed a little bit. I think everybody realizes federal priorities have shifted a little bit. Some of the funding that I thought maybe could be available for this are not. It's not so clear that it'll happen. We also didn't get some of the state funding that were in some of the budget requests that we asked for that would be matched towards federal funding. So it went from what looked like it would be something we could fund to probably being less likely that we'd be able to pay for the structure. And it's, the cost estimates came in, I think, pretty conservatively in the $30 to $40 million range, depending on a lot of geotechnical work that Jeff can explain further. But there's a lot of unknowns about the actual, what it would take to do the geotech. So that cost could come down, but even if it got cut in half, I think we'd still have a hard time finding funding to pay for that anytime soon. And so one of the things that I've been, really considering is, we're based on Christine's isomass curves and other, obviously like functioning on a basis of how much salt mass we have. I think it's time to start kind of thinking about like what we want to do in the near term. I don't know that there's anything to be done, this spring during runoff, but I think shortly after runoff, we are probably going to need to convene and try to understand, where the salt mass is and whether or not we think we need to do something to allow salt to return from the North Arm. And I think that could be as simple as opening up the breach and allowing for some of those bidirectional flows to reestablish. And that kind of accomplishes like really what we're after with that structure is being able to reestablish the flow of north to south. Again, at times where we need the salt. So anyway, I guess long story short, as we're looking at the needs of the lake and where budgets got cut this year in both the state and the federal budgets, it's become pretty evident to me that we're probably gonna have to long game the berm analysis. I don't think it was a waste of money by any means to do this analysis because we really needed to know like what's possible, how much it would cost, and then we can continue to work on that. But I wanted to throw this out there, and this has not been something, I know you guys haven't seen this analysis yet, but again, I'll send this out. But I guess my initial reaction is that there's components of this that I think exist regardless, like protecting the causeway opening. So we're able to prevent wave action from deteriorating a rock berm, or, if we were to put a structure in, I think those are things that are probably necessary to provide for more predictability and modeling and everything. So my thought is there may be something we could do to help protect those, perhaps, a jetty or something on either end. That was part of what the proposal was, protecting that opening. And I think that, again, it could apply regardless of what we do. It may also solve the issue, to your point, Ryan, of being able to put something out there for measuring. That's kind of the spit or whatever we put out there to be able to install something like that. So we may be able to do something at the same time to accomplish that. But I do think we could look at what it would cost to build that. Again, that'll help protect any structure we put in for wave action sessions that could deteriorate that, as we've seen in the past. And it also leaves room in the future for if we do decide that we want to put in if we get the funding to do an engineered structure, that infrastructure is already there. And that was a part of pretty much any plan that we have. So I think there's some benefits to that. And then I think that in general, we can do a lot to manage the import of salts from the north to south just through lowering the rockfill causeway. So anyway, from a cost benefit analysis, I think it's going to be pretty hard to justify the cost of a really engineered structure. So I'll send this out to everybody, but I'd love to hear everybody's thoughts on, what you think about, I guess waiting on, an engineered structure. I don't think it's anything we can do now, regardless of funding, but like, how much do people think we should be pursuing that? Is it worth $30 or $40 million, or are there other ways we can improve Great Salt Lake and put that money to use? And maybe the rockfill berm has been just the tool we've needed. So if anybody has any thoughts, I'd love the feedback. Maybe it's a discussion for another day when we've had a chance to review what Jacob's put together. But anyway, does anybody have any feedback on that?
It's the cost each time the berm has been modified.
That's a good question. I should have mentioned that. So that was another point that what I've analyzed is that right now we have no cost. Last time Union Pacific did it at no cost to us. We do have funding, ongoing funding available to, do the monitoring for the berm and the flows and everything. That's how we pay for a lot of what USGS does, is through this funding that we have for modifying the berm. But in the past, we've been able to work with UV to get it done for free. I don't know that they'll always do that, especially if we start having to move it a lot. So we may want to think about what that would look like to improve the other access on the other side as well. So we don't need such a long boom, or to, build it out and then, take it back as we come back. All of the options that Jacobs came up with also had a really expensive ongoing cost. Like the really engineered structure was over $1 million. I think it was about $1 million a year in ongoing expenses. And then also probably some intermittent additional expenses if we have to replace gates and other things. Pumping has costs, moving blocks, everything had an ongoing expense that is more expensive than our pile of rocks. So I think at the end of the day, it's just, when we're getting into this, suspenders kind of budget years, I think that it makes sense to me to focus the funding that we could put into that into other tools like, acquiring water rights or leasing water rights for the lake, or, other ways that we could improve the vitality. I think that was certainly something that we did, but currently there's no expense, to answer your question.
Before the UP volunteered to help us modify the berm, we got we thought a really outrageous estimate of $500,000 for one of those modifications. But, I think it was just because they didn't know how difficult it might be
We did pay originally, the first modification we actually did pay for, and if I recall correctly, it was hundreds of thousands of dollars, and that was because of the unknowns of, how you get rock out there, for example, like where do you go to a quarry and get that much rock and get it all the way out into the breach? Like that was actually the bulk of the cost. And so,
Well, I see.
Yeah.
Just get the rock from the, lakeside.
well, that's UP's quarry, so we can't make them give us rock. So if they're willing to, then it works out great. But if we had to like bring that rock in, or they wouldn't sell it to us, that's where it gets expensive. But they were willing to, like, they gave us the rock, they transported the rock, they basically placed the rock. And so you can't get a much of a sweeter deal. But I think now the rock is there, and yeah, I think that's hopefully
So it
they'll
sounds like
continue to
there's-
help.
Just don't really know kind of what level of cooperation UP is going to provide.
My gut is that they were so cooperative last time that they'll continue to help us out. I think that at the very minimum, I think we could probably find a way to get some of their, they have some rock, I forget what their reject rock. Yeah, the stuff that just doesn't meet their standards that they're willing to provide. And for us, it's fine, right? Like, we don't care if it's 3 feet or 3.5 feet, like, it's probably going to work. There's going to be a size component to it, but I think we could probably get them to give us some of their reject, maybe even consider hauling it. I know one of the factors for them was, like, they didn't want our contractors out on their railroad, like, doing all this stuff, because there's a lot of propensity to slow things down for them, so they could do it a lot faster. So anyway, I think they'll help out. I just think it's, if we can get to a point where we know how often we have to do it, and maybe do a better job of, well, not a better job. I think we've done a great job exporting the salt, but I think that we'll probably, I think my thought on this is through some modeling to understand the bidirectional flows, trying to get it right to where we lower it down enough where we can have something that's like basically balancing out the export of salt with the import that we bring back. So we can kind of look at it and say, in this elevation range, we want to stick around this salt mass. So here's about where we put it based off of the modeling to try to understand how much we'll move back and forth. And I know that's not perfect, so we may have to go back in and tweak it. But I think if we started seeing we're bringing back too much salt, I think we have realized through this whole thing in the last 3 to 5 years that we can get rid of salt. That's not a problem. We can do that every spring runoff as long as we're getting some water to the lake. We can move water or salt to the north. So I think that's my take on it. But again, that's why we're here to get everybody else's take.
Ben, I think we should give some thought to, may we in the future come into a situation where we do want to import salt without exporting salt.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that situation will be there, but if there is a possibility that we get into a situation like that, then I do think that a different engineering solution would be necessary to achieve that. It could be done with a simple concrete block design, because you could leave openings, and sort of straddle those openings and have return for it. But
we did investigate that, and I think that the hurdle of that is that in all circumstances, the most head difference you can have was like 2 feet tops. When you can have a head difference of 2 feet from south to the north and still bring that back. And so, like, we look at elevations today, and it's been open for we've had that thing open almost 2 years now here in July, and we still have almost a foot of head difference. So the times where we would be able to actually operate and bring that back, that was one of the other constraining factors. Like, how often do we only have 2 feet of head difference where we want to bring that back? And so I think that that's a huge constraint. One of the things we did investigate or ask Jacobs to really look at was whether a pump could work, right? Like how, exactly. Like, and I talked to Joe last Salinity committee meeting about that. It's like, you guys aren't operating in the shoulder seasons. Could there be a possibility of doing that? And I think logistically, there's a lot of other challenges from I think everybody uses different terms, but what do we call it? Clobber salts, or the parabolite, whatever you want to call it. I think there's issues with the slush, the formation of those clobber salts that can make those pumps non-workable, or perhaps have some challenges with that. There's also capacity issues, but I do think those are things where, like, if we could run that for 3 months and we're bringing back that much salt, if we're managing it right, I think that fits into it. I think where it gets a little scary to me is when we start to get into high lake elevations. If we're up at like 4198 and we've exported all this salt, we're going to be really fresh on the south arm, and that's going to be really hard to bring the salt back. at that elevation, make it work. So I don't know. I mean, we can, I think right now, again, I think one of the tactics that I'm suggesting is that if we were to build up the structures to protect the opening, that has to happen regardless. I think all of the scenarios, the blocks, the really super engineered structure, all of those required some protection. So that, but that's also expensive. It's just like Ryan's point, you have probably either build your way out to it, build it and then remove that stuff, or bring a barge out with rock on it. So I think that, you know, if we can figure that component out, that'll reduce the overall cost later on. And then, you know, if we get to the point where we really want to come up with that engineered structure, if there are other ways to do it, or if we ever wanted to consider like, you know, pump station that we could use in the summer months when compasses and decent pairs, you know, we could do that. I think just throwing out some other ideas, but like, Ryan, your point of Newfoundland Basin bringing things back, you know, I've started trying to poke around with the, you know, the BLM and the UTTR folks to see like, what would that look like if we started to actually bring some of that water back? But there was a Neil, I can't remember Neil's last name, Neil Amagon, I think. At one point, it talked about if we were to drain Newfoundland Basin, there's about potentially like 80,000 acre feet of water each year that pools there and evaporates, doesn't have a whole lot of ecological value because it's, you know, hypersaline. What if we use that as a tool occasionally to be able to bring that to the South Arm if we had to have an import of salt, or like, you know, with the mineral companies, what if we use, you know, the flushing of their ponds to be strategic about where and when we put those in? I mean, I think there's other tools we could explore that are a little more adaptable than just that limited 2 feet of head difference. But again, this is way up here and I'm just trying to brainstorm all the possibilities. And it might be that we just have to have like a lot of different tools to do this. And it's a multi-faceted approach. But I think this year, building that infrastructure to protect it, my gut is that we should just do that because we need to do it anyway. And then we continue to learn, model, understand the isomass curves and how it relates to different elevations. That's something I want to touch on with our CMP is that, you know, we want to take that elevation matrix and really incorporate salinity into that. And I think that that's kind of how we're envisioning that, is using those isomass curves and refining those to say, you know, this elevation, we think this is about salinity mass that we want to be shooting for, and trying to kind of incorporate that in and get into that matrix. So we have a really comprehensive look at like what the lake is doing. And I think we'll just continue to develop tools for how we could work with the different lake level paradigms.
And Tom, also, instead of looking at it as though you want to prevent South Arm salt from going north, it might be better just to look at a net flow of salt.
Absolutely.
So if you have a deeper, you know, a lower berm, you get a lot more North Arm salt coming in than you would have. And it also equalizes the difference in elevation between the two. And when that happens, you get a lot more salt.
Yeah, and we saw that. We saw that when, you know, when we put in the new breach, and after we had, you know, a lot of export in the beginning, then we started to see that return flow and that effect that you mentioned. Absolutely. I do think that the continued modeling of the berm structure at these different elevations is going to be crucial for us.
Yep. I agree. And I think there's other things too, like we can look at, you know, improving the modeling so we understand it. Everything we do gives us more information about, you know, what we need. I know, Craig, you guys have been trying to refine the algorithms and everything. We had a good discussion about like, you know, improving that. And I think like every day we learn more, and every day that we have new data, it helps contribute to a better understanding. So if we can keep doing that and keep building towards, you know, the end goal of having something that's super adaptable, maybe we'll get there one day. But again, $40 million right now seems insane. Last year, when we were talking like 30 or 40, I was like, well, we might be able to make that work. Like things have been pretty flush, and we've been, you know, the federal government's putting money into the lake, and this has been one of the primary tools we've been able to preserve the, you know, the ecology of the South Arm. But it does seem like that's going to be harder under, you know, under the current paradigm. So anyway, my suggestion is take a look at the information we send out, and then I think as spring runoff is dying down and we get together again and understand where the salt mass is, what happened this year, that's another year under our belt that we can analyze. In the meantime, I was going to try to make a request to see if we could do some modeling on the bidirectional flows, just to see like if there's the ability to try to at least static from north to south, south to north, with what we lose and what we gain. And then I think when we revisit this, you know, come June or whenever runoff ends, we decide if we should take that down I am a little hesitant to make rash decisions because I think that everything I saw, like water users and everything else, indicates we're probably going into another long drought period. And I think I'd be a little remiss to say that we want to bring a bunch of salt back if we're about to dive into another drought. But at the same time, as long as we're getting any inflows to the lake, I think we can get rid of salt pretty efficiently. I think we've proven that. So I don't know that it's the end of the world. But again, that's why you all exist. You guys are way smarter than I am. So I think we just got to put our heads together and try to figure out what the path forward looks like. So I'll send that out after this meeting to this group. And if anybody has any thoughts or epiphanies or, thinks we need to meet before the spring runoff is done, let's do that. But I think, in general, that should be the next discussion point, is whether we want to build those protective structures, whether we want to lower the breach. And otherwise, I think my opinion is that we leave it where it's at until we figure out what the next move is.
What was the railroad's take on? I mean, we dumped rock in there.
Yeah.
But what about removing it? How was that going to be? The same response time, same kind of thing?
I think removing it would be us. I don't think they would be so inclined to come out and do that. I think they actually, if I'm remembering correctly, I think their word of caution was like, there's really big rocks and they're going to be a hell of a lot harder to get out than they were to put in. But so you guys might want to consider that. So some of those rocks were so large that the long arm, had trouble being able to lift it. I think they would be able to place it, nudge it, and scoot it. But I think they were talking about having like a hydraulic ram to break some of the rocks up if we ever had to remove them.
That's
Yep. But with that said, it also ate a 4-foot notch in the top of the berm. So maybe some of those rocks disappeared. And we need to, and it's not going to be as difficult. And that's another point, is like, if we could improve the other side, we wouldn't need such a long arm. We'd be able to come from both sides. You could cut your boom in half, and you wouldn't have the issue of what you can lift when it's fully extended.
Well, and I was wondering about the blocks too. The more rock you throw in there, are you going to ultimately try to be setting blocks in there and having them offset and a little?
That's, I mean, Jacobs contemplated what that is. And again, like the bulk of the cost, well, not the bulk, I should say, but a lot of the cost was on all of the footings and pilings and geotechnical work that has to come in. And they were basing that off of geotechnical work that was like not at the site. That wasn't part of the scope of this, was to conduct geotech. It was stuff that the railroad did. And I think the Jacobs team, Jeff, you can speak to this more, but they were pretty surprised at how horrible the geotech looked. So I think that there's a lot of, I think we went out and actually did the geotech. There could be some major cost savings, understanding what is actually happening at this site as opposed to some of the sites that they were having a lot of troubles where they did the geotech. I know the railroad told me at one point there's one spot on the lake where they were like sinking feet per year. And there's just a few really gnarly spots where they lose it. And I don't think this is one of them. I think it's further into the middle of the lake. So we could potentially cut that geotech work and all the footings and foundations substantially. So that might be a place where we can shape it up if we do some work up front. Sorry, Bill.
Bill has his hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I hear good support for the continued modeling of the flow through the breach. But I think it's time to do a retrospective on that to understand, okay, what have we gained through that modeling effort? Because that's been going on for a number of years now. And, what's been the investment in that? What have we gained? And then what are we aiming at for continued modeling? I think that'd be a useful exercise for the committee to do.
Yeah. I mean, I personally, I think that, without having gone through the exercise, I think that the modeling, in my opinion, has allowed us to make educated decisions on how things work, but none of the modeling has been, good enough to say, this is what's going to happen. It's like kind of influences the realm of where we want to be, but I think there's still some guesswork. But I think that, again, I think a lot of these things are becoming refined enough that, hopefully in the coming years, we'll have a model that's sufficient enough to say, if we do this, we are pretty confident here's what's going to happen. And I think that'll really help with the management decisions. And I think that another thing we really want to move to as well, Bill, is like in our CMP, we want it to be super interactive, but I think we also want to be able to start to forecast out a little bit and say, all right, so here's our 1, 3, and 5 year thoughts, and like under these different paradigms, here's where we might expect to go based on the salt mass and the elevation this year. So if these, if we get this hydrologic year and this type of like wet, dry summer, here are the things we think could happen. So we want to be cognizant. Every year we're updating these forecasts to be able to say, we're thinking about it, and this is the kind of stuff we want to, we think we're okay because we're within this window. So we don't have to do anything, or wow, we're really erring on the side of being like too fresh or too saline. So we should lower that and try to do better, or we should raise it and improve that and then recalibrate the next year. So that's the ultimate goal. But I do agree. I think it'd be great to try to understand how that modeling, how that investment or what the return on the investment was. Maybe a good research proposal.
I want to be clear that I'm totally in favor of the modeling. It's just that there's the modeling in the breach itself, and then there's the boundary conditions around that, which is the rest of the lake, right? And so understanding that connection, that trade-off is I think going to be really important for guiding the continued modeling. And so that's why I'd like to have a review is where have we gotten to and where would we like to get to, and what is the balance between modeling and the breach itself versus a broader modeling attempt.
Go ahead, Thomas.
I think Bill has a great idea because initially we had some issues with the model and we had to bring in sort of the salt mass to figure out what was really going on. It would be nice to do a retrospective and then see how we've been able to improve that and where we want to go to. I would definitely second that idea.
Craig, do you have any thoughts on like how how SOM's work continues to influence and improve the modeling? I mean, I think that we went from an area where we had an incredible, or I guess a huge lack of confidence on salinity and salt modeling, better influence, or I guess a better confidence in lake elevations. But it seems to me like the salinity and the bidirectional flow modeling has improved over the years. Is that accurate, or do you think we need to?
His flow modeling does a good job of predicting the effects of what would happen with a particular berm configuration. Yeah. And they have modeled flat berms, not one with a notch in it, so that that work doesn't really apply to what's happening today. But one of the problems with what SOM has done is he always looks at a specific range of salinity and the berm elevation. And in what we do, we can't always assume that the salinity is going to be X or that the berm elevation is going to be Y. So he has another student who's looking at solving some of the problems that Ed Hawley had in his algorithms that did the two-way flow. And one of the things that I didn't realize that really affected what the north to south arm flow was that when the north arm became higher than the south arm, occasionally it just shuts off. It doesn't give any answers. And what it does is it just gives you the last answer that was valid, and which in a lot of cases was really way off. So we're solving a lot of those problems now by understanding the flow configurations a little bit better. And his students and us and SOM are working on a more generalized solution, which I feel is what we've needed all along. And hopefully by the end of the summer, we'll have something working.
Because I think that investigation that Bill is speaking of it, that you're talking about, I mean, I would love to understand what does that look like and ask the right questions. I don't know that I totally formulating in my head how we would go about that analysis to understand what's needed there. So maybe it's an offline conversation, but I think that if you have any ideas about how we would be able to understand the benefits or how that's evolved or changed over the years, I mean, I think that's what you're asking, right? So I don't know, whether for the investment, is that kind of what we're talking about here? Do we continue to build this model if it's not giving us what we need, or is there a more simple solution like the isomass curves and salt mass, and maybe we don't need to understand that quite as much to continue to refine?
No, I think at least I would be in agreement that, a workable model that we can rely on is something that would be really useful.
Yeah.
The question is, because of what Craig is explaining and what happened in the past, is can we get there?
Yeah. what's that?
and what does that
And I
look
think,
like?
I think that was also one of the benefits of the engineering structure is that it was easier to model. So having a regular, structure was something that I think we all desired. But yeah, that's going to be a continuing.
And one of the primary recommendations that you'll see in the report is, I think exactly what Bill's saying, is we need to look at the bigger picture modeling effort, the water and salt balance in combination. Because the biggest struggle we had was, what are the design criteria? What flows should we assume? What salinities should we assume, in designing the structure? Because those four variables, the water level, density on either side of, drive the flow through any structure. And then when you start to look at that breach, the new breach in combination with the lakeside breach, with fluctuations in lake level and flows to the south arm, and it just becomes, how is this going to function? And I think that gets into what Ben mentioned with, we can shut off the south to north flow and pull, 900 to 1,000 CFS from the north to the south if we have to with a engineered structure. But we need to have that head differential to be pretty low, 6 inches or so, and which is great in a static snapshot. But we know that if you have flow going in one direction, that side is going to have to drop at water level at some point. And so that's that dynamic looking over time.
Yeah. And that's interesting information because we didn't know that a while ago. And, that really helps us because then we get to a situation, if we go below 4191, where the berm actually shuts off the north arm, then we're sort of stuck with what we have. And the only way to bring brine back, if we were to need that at some point, and that may happen as we may then keep exporting salt every year, then the only way to do that is actively doing it, or with some of those alternative suggestions you have.
And I think that's my opinion, is that we should continue to develop the alternatives, because I do think that we have to be really conscious about the process now. And that 4190 cutoff doesn't give a lot of options to have something that's adaptable. Like that didn't even contemplate something that could allow for bidirectional flows. So I think that's, but also I think if we're down at 4190, there's also a lot of other things that are happening, right? Like there's a lot of the voluntary agreements with the mineral companies kick in to reducing diversions. I think there's a lot of different triggers that are happening there. And then also I would argue that that elevation, our salt mass is so much lower based on those isomass curves that we're kind of in a different paradigm than we are even today. So,
but we could be in a situation where sort of the back of the envelope calculations were telling us that we may be able to maintain that elevation of 4191 even under these extreme drought conditions that we saw, in the last spell up until 2 years ago. And if that's the case, then on a yearly basis, we would be exporting some salt to the north through, overflow of that brine. At some point, we may get to just not the terminal lake, but a freshwater lake. And I know that's, an extreme situation.
I do think there's room to continue to look at the other alternatives to see if there's ways that we can solve that. But then also if we find that we're likely to be in that scenario, like if we start getting, ticking down and we're heading in that direction, I do think that if we had to go have a conversation with the legislature about what that would look like, I think they'd be super amenable to hearing this out. But I just don't know. I think they are, really hoping, cross fingers, hoping we'll never get there. But I do think we should figure out what other alternatives exist before we go try to, change that law at this point. I think that was that was pretty.
Well, the fact that it's such a small elevation difference between north and south really does change the paradigm of spending so much money on an engineering solution that is only marginally effective.
I think the other primary recommendation is that doing some soil borings there.
Yeah.
Because that's 60% of the cost. And, that even makes we looked at the blocks idea, and, we can use culverts instead of, if the engineered structure is was developed based on the fact that the limiting condition that we wanted to have was to pull north arm water back to the south. We know a berm does a great job of sending south arm to the north, but if we have to flip flop and go to a different strategy, then we need to have an opening at the bottom. And so we can do that with big concrete box culverts and then stacking blocks on top. But if we want to control flow, we need to have some structural stability. We need to know that those culverts aren't going to sink away, or they're not going to tilt or break apart. And that's where all of a sudden the blocks approach became expensive, because now we still need to build a foundation. We still need pilings and all these things. So I think those are possibilities. With rock, we can pile rock, and usually, because we don't know if our berm has sunk into the lake bed. But those are, it's been good enough for what we had.
I think that's again why, like my suggestion is to continue on the path of being able to get the protective structure, and I think we'll have to do some geotechnical. That will really help influence and refine the cost if we know what the geotech looks like. I think those are things we can do in conjunction, and I think there's a way right now that I can spend what we spend on the Jacobs on our ongoing funding that allows us to modify that berm, and that would essentially give us a budget next year of $1 million to play around with doing some of this rock and geotech stuff. So I think we could start getting close to being able to implement the initial stage of this, and then again, if things look up in the budgets for everyone, maybe we revisit this engineered structure as being a solution. But I think again these alternatives. I have several other ideas I think that could be really feasible. I'd love to pick your brain with Thomas, see if you have any feedback on. But I think there's a lot of different ways we could bring salt back if we really needed to. But hopefully we'll be able to manage it through the rock filter.
Could you get some civil data by driving Ryan's pilings if he wants to drive?
Yeah, I mean was an expensive concept, but I think we probably could.
Some pressures.
I think if you were to do borings out there, you're close into the same rig for the borings, to also drive some pilings out.
We tell you soil stability.
That's it for you, Ryan.
Yeah, man, appreciate that. Yeah. It's all about the mobilization costs of getting a barge and a pile dragger out there. It's super expensive just to get stuff out there. Yeah. So if you can, how often?
I think we can. I think if we start investigating this, I think there's a lot of room for us to pile these on and try to get as many of these answers done. I'll just put in one more plug. 15 days to put in a research proposal to tell us about these things. So if anybody's super interested,
Let's drill the salt crust while we're out there.
hey,
There you go.
I'll say that it's there for a reason.
No, this is, yeah, I'm sorry, but we started with the discussion about the model and ended up with the engineering thing again. And what I find fascinating is a barge-based geoprobe actually would be an incredibly useful thing for both the engineering and science work. And that is really worth thinking about.
I know this great University of Utah professor could probably write up a great proposal for our April 4th deadline, Bill.
That's ET Tech is the one that could do this. Okay, well, we'll have to news about that.
Good. Well, I want to, so before you, just this Newfoundland Basin water, is that currently just evaporating that 80,000 acre feet? Is there, should there be a exploration on trying to get that back or see what the cost would be?
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm looking at trying to do right now. So we've started to have some discussions with UTTR and BLM. And people have to talk with SITLA. I think there's some complexities because if we started bringing that back, it's obviously going to bring some minerals back with it. And I think that a lot of those minerals could have arguably been exported from the lake when we did the pumping. And so who knows who will have claims on those and how we would deal with that. But I think in general, it could be complicated really quick, or maybe we'll ask and they'll be like, oh, hell yeah, take it on back. So we're trying to get a hold of the right people right now to kind of start investigating that. But I do think it's worth pursuing to see if nothing else, you can even have that go to the north arm just for elevations. But I think if we wanted to use that as a tool to bring it back into the South Arm or Salinity, that could be a pretty good tool too. So thoughts.
Well, good. Well, I think I want to pivot because I want to make sure we've got time to go through what Christine's prepared. As Ben mentioned, the salinity is obviously an important metric for Great Salt Lake, and it's going to be an important part of the comprehensive management plan. And traditionally, we used lake level. Ideally, salinity would be tied to lake level, but now that we've been playing with berm, and with other kind of structures, salinity is not necessarily tied to lake level anymore. And so I think the importance of these isomass curves that USGS has been working on and others and developing do provide us a new tool to be able to look at the mass of salt in the South Arm as a metric for how we can manage the lake. And whether that's water flow through the breaches or salt flow through the breaches, the isomass curves really help provide that. And so I think with the comprehensive management plan, we're looking at how can we make the lake level matrix more, I guess, easier to use. I think when you look at the current lake level metrics, most people, when you talk to them, everybody agrees it's been super helpful. But I think most people, when they look at it, they just look at the green zone along the middle and say, okay, this is where we want to be. But we also know we have a lot of other managers who are looking at specific uses or specific resources in the lake. And, and it's hard to, there's so much information on that one matrix that it's hard to read. And so we're contemplating, looking at, is there an overall lake level that we can look at where it is just, are we, what's high, what's low, what's good. But then also on the same side of the salinity, where do we sit today? And so one of the challenges that I think we identified was, well, aside from what Christine and Ryan present at these salinity committee meetings, and I guess if you go to NWIS and you look at what is the salinity at the different times and from USGS data set, it's hard to have an idea of, well, what is the salinity of the South Arm? And because there's a range, we're sampling at numerous locations around the lake, and we haven't had a way to really come up with a value that's descriptive of the salinity of the upper brine layer of the South Arm. And so if we were able to, if that upper brine layer number is something that's useful, that potentially is useful, for the division of water quality, it's something that's useful for us as we look at the isomass curves. It's useful in the modeling, the long-term salt and water modeling, looking at how we're protective of the uses in the upper brine layer. It'd be great to have one number that we can agree on, or we can use as a metric. And so that ties into the comprehensive management plan, because, it's very hard to explain to people, not only why are we talking about grams per liter instead of percentages, and upper brine layer versus deep brine layer, and it depends on where you are in the lake. It's just, a simple question from somebody becomes, they zone out usually. And so I think if just the conversations that we've had is, it would be very helpful if we could come up with a means of trying to integrate this information into a value for the South Arm that, certainly we're not going to get rid of all the details and the nuances that are very real, but is there a number that we can use that can help guide us, when we're making decisions? And so that ties into the comprehensive management plan. I think it's going to tie into how we manage breach or berm structure, even potentially with discharges. But the question is, well, how can we do that? And so we started talking with Christine about how could we do this? And so that's, I think, I guess the next on the agenda is just her salinity estimates for this coming year. But I think we'll kind of dive right into the isomass curves, and because we've made some changes to that, and it's not the numbers themselves, but just how we present it, and then how can we come up with a number for the upper Brine?
Jeff, do you mind if I add one thing to that? I think that in the CMP, one of the things that we're trying to accomplish, like, is that one number is kind of like a snapshot of like today. What does the health of the lake look like? Are the brine shrimp and the brine flies and other things, microbialites, are they happy with the salinity? But then the salt mass is like what are we going to do with the breach, and what does the next 1, 3, and 5 years look like? And then I think being able to assess the health of the lake, I think also, if we're just going off of the L matrix, I think we're missing a really important component of salinity in that picture. And so when like the Grow Your Flow billboards that said, we're in the red, the lake is in the worst condition, but yet we're having like really good bird surveys and things are going really well on the ecological front. I think it's a little disingenuous for us not to be able to say, actually, we've been able to manage the salt, so we would assess the lake health at like yellow or something, because lake elevation's here. So, we're not super happy about some of the consequences we have with that, but like, salinity, we're doing pretty good. So some way to kind of give folks a real picture of what's going on at the lake, so that I don't want people to think the lake is dead and they should give up on it. I think people need to understand that we're doing our very best, to manage the functionality that's there, and then also understand, the kind of the difference between salt mass and that little snapshot for a day. So anyway.
Good, thanks. And so, if you want to go ahead, Colin.
Well, I think Ben brings up a really important point. Is you are doing great work, and if people think that there's nothing that can be done, they just sort of give up, and then you don't get the support anymore. So I agree. It's a great point.
You did list Smokey the Bear.
Bring that Smokey the Bear.
What about the owl? Give a hoot.
Yeah.
Right? Don't
I think the fat Smokey is a little more personable. The rip a little intimidating.
Maybe a whale. I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just dive into the forecast for 2025 for spring and fall, and I'll start by just showing everyone the trajectory of South Arm salt mass that we've been observing since roughly May or June of 2023. So as you all know, installed the berm, and we've had a lot of salt export occurring over this time. But more interestingly, as of February, our most recent measurements, the mass started to go up a little bit. And I think we're starting to see bidirectional flow potentially at the breach, or even potentially through the causeway fill, that these measurements indicate salt mass may be increasing. Also, I wouldn't be surprised if this is in the realm of uncertainty. Maybe the last month and this month are statistically the same, but it is an interesting observation. And I'll also point out that since June of 2023 to now to our February measurements, we've decreased South Arm salt mass by an estimated 216 million tons. If I model the net flux through the causeway breach at West Crack and including Lakeside, the estimate is more around 239 metric tons. And actually, I did that last month as well, and they were pretty in sync, those two numbers of what we're measuring, the decrease in the South Arm and what we measured as flux at the breach. And I think this is additional evidence that maybe we're not capturing all of the flux coming back in from the North Arm. That could be, again, due to flow through causeway fill, or just these monthly measurements we have to get north to south measurements. We may be missing a lot, especially during dynamic lake conditions when you have sesh setting up and a lot of salt movement happening during those dynamic events. But this is kind of where we are in terms of salt mass right now. 894 million tons is our most recent measurement. So I'll just kind of walk us through our forecast. So here's our back in the envelope calculation that I do. I start with our most recent measurements of salinity from February of 27th in this case. Consider export of salt to the north through the breaches, flows coming in from inflows, and import from the north. And that kind of equation, we were able to back out a spring salinity. And we also predict volume with similar inputs, starting with our volume in the south arm brine or water volume in February. Consider what's leaving through through the new breach, what's leaving through evaporation, what's added precip, inflows, and flow from north to south. And a lot of these inputs come from the GSLIM compiled data set of precip, evaporation, and inflows. So our initial condition, February 27, 2025, we had a volume weighted salinity of 115 grams per liter. And our volume on that day of sampling was 6.28 million acre feet. I like to just kind of give you an idea of the variables that I'm modifying, the assumptions I'm making. South to north discharge, I'm estimating that are anywhere from 800 to 200 CFS. And in this case, I use discharge from water year 2024, just a monthly estimate of discharge. And that's because lake elevations are pretty similar to what they were last year. And so that's kind of what I flipped in there. I consider 3 climatic conditions and average conditions: a wet, cool, and a warm, dry. We'll see those. And then at the breach salinity, I kind of have to guess an incremental decrease in salinity also monthly, so that affects the salt fluxes that I estimate. And then I hold constant inflow salinity at 4 grams per liter. So I'll just get to the predictions. So for spring 2025, I've got 3 conditions. I'm in no change to the berm for any of these. But on the top row is average precip and evaporation and inflows. The middle line is a warm, dry condition. So that uses, I think, 20th percentile precipitation values and 90th percentile of evaporation. And I also use I think a 20th percentile for inflow. So it's a pretty extreme condition, but it's just a bracket. And then on the bottom row is a wet, cool condition. So as usual, there's a really big range. Our average climatic condition results in a salinity of 108 by the end of June, 108 grams per liter. South arm salt mass, 29 million tons. And a lake elevation of 4192.9. For the warm drier, we're seeing more saline conditions, 120, and for the wet cool, 92 grams per liter.
Christine, the average conditions is based on how many years? Is it 20 years, 6 years?
2003 to 2022,
okay.
So about 20 years. Yeah. And the NRCS forecasted peak elevation, as Jeff mentioned, is 4193.8. So in the context of these scenarios, that would put us between average and a wet cool scenario. So that's kind of that one. If we move forward to the fall, this slide also, so this is salinities by the end of October, starting with average in the top row, average climatic conditions, and then warm, dry in the middle row, and wet, cool in the bottom row. So again, huge range, 92 to 131 grams per liter, with average conditions somewhere around 113 grams per liter. And I will say last year was really challenging to predict over the summer because evaporative rates were so much higher that really high temperatures were not captured in this historical kind of climate data set that's being fed into this. So I will say that I think it's going to be a really important consideration as we move forward to try and anticipate like the trajectory of temperature and its effect on evaporation moving forward, because that had a really big effect on last summer's salinity increases. Okay, what else can I say here? And I guess I'll just generally point out that for a warm, dry condition, we're exporting less water to the north. So you end up exporting, exporting less salt to the north, and you get more salt in the south arm retained. For a wetter condition, you export a lot more salt to the north, and you end up with less salt mass, as you might expect. So just kind of conceptually makes sense. And then this last slide is, I didn't vary the climate, their average for average conditions for all 3 of these rows, but what I did do is I said, what if we don't change the berm in the top row? What if we raise the berm August 1st? And then this last one is basically like, what if my estimates of what was going to be return flow from north to south are 10 times higher? What's the effect on the predicted salinities? So just, this is me very incrementally trying to understand the sensitivities in these models. And so you can see more flux from north to south, getting more salt into the south arm really increases salt mass, it increases salinity a little bit. But I think, again, the effect of that is more long-term in our incremental changing of the salt mass in the south arm. So Are there any questions or want me to review any of this?
Just a question about the berm. You're assuming no change. Has it stabilized? And when's the last survey been done of the structure?
So actually, we had our crews out about a week ago, doing a survey of the berm, and I think they were able to. They strung a tag line up right above the berm, and were able to get an 80 CP flowing over it. So we're really optimistic that we'll actually be able to get a new profile of the berm this time, and they're crunching the numbers. So hopefully, we'll be able to update you on that soon. To see if there's any change. I think the last kind of profile we were able to develop was from October 2023, because the last one we did last year wasn't very successful. They had some problems with the drone imagery and just the depth of the water. It was just really hard to see the bottom. So, any other questions on this stuff? Okay, oops. Okay, and then if we kind of look at our isomass curve, maybe this is a good time to do that, Jeff. So if you recall, the last improvement, or I guess addition to this ISO, or modification to this isomass plot, was that on the y-axis we're now looking at south arm elevation, and the x-axis is still a shallow salinity value. And so what I'm plotting here, the dots represent just raw salinity values, and there's salinity values that we consider shallow, so less than a 4 meter, collected at less than a 4 meter depth. So that's what I understand the group is trying to manage for. But what Jeff asked me to do is to kind of extend the axes for the south arm from 4180 to 4212 to just put where we are in a greater context of where lake levels could go, and also to extend the salinity axis from 50 to 250 grams per liter to just get a much bigger picture of the possibilities here. And then these isomass lines, these gray lines, represent salt masses in the south arm, starting from 400 million tons all the way up to 4 billion tons. So, and then this blue line is, or these kind of blue shading is the target elevation range specified in the commissioner's strategic plan. And that can be, we can leave that off or whatever. It was just kind of something that we at USGS thought provided some additional context. And then this orange shaded box represents the optimal salinity range as identified by this committee, from 120 to 160 grams per liter for the fall. And then I also put on here a spring optimal salinity, which maybe is debatable, from 90 to 130 grams per liter. But that came from the interim berm management protocol where it called out that document. So now we can look at kind of our historic observations from 2010 to present in this context of target salinity ranges, target elevation ranges, as well as salt mass. And right now, February 2025, we're kind of sitting right in this range of, again, around 115, 120 grams per liter, 4193. So we're in a favorable range for spring. And then taking the bounds of what I had just showed you on the previous slides, I just created these ellipsoidal shapes to kind of bracket where spring salinities might be, as well as the fall salinities where they might be. So hopefully that's useful. And I think maybe, Jeff, you want to facilitate a conversation on the isomass plots and how it can be improved further. Or one important, I think, thing to keep in mind is that to calculate these lines for the mass, it's assuming that the water column is a uniform salinity. And we know that that's not true all the time, especially when the deep brine layer is present. So I'm trying to work with Scott a little bit on this to come up with kind of a two sets of plots. So essentially, when we have a deep brine layer and there's mass held, maybe 10 to 12% of our salt mass is held in the deep brine layer, this is not necessarily going to be an accurate depiction of an alignment of those points with the mass, or so we're trying to think of a way to capture that a little bit better. For the condition we've been in, where it's been relatively uniform, it's an appropriate plot to use. But when we start to get sequestration at depth, we need to be really careful, I think, about how we modify this a little bit to capture that.
Are you able to capture, like, just not in the isomass curve, but just in general, are you able to estimate salt mass with the deep brine layer at any given time?
Yes, if we have, so how we've done that in the past is we can use profile data to identify where that interface is, and then we can kind of create a slice at the bottom of the lake with it tied to a salinity value and compute the mass there. So we have done that. And the central tendency of data from 2010 to 2022 was about 12% of the salt mass is held in the deep brine layer at depth when the deep brine layer is present. But it does vary. And I think, you remember, Scott, how much it varies from like 8 to 20%, just depending on how thick that layer is at any given time. Which, by the way, when we start to see that, if GSLIP can actually record that interface depth, then we can have a monthly time step. That would be super helpful.
So yeah, I guess the question, and we're trying to develop a set of curves here that we can incorporate into the comprehensive management plan. I think would help this committee in terms of salinity management. And I know when we were looking at the flow control structure, we were thinking, well, what happens if the lake does get back up to 4195 or 4198? What kinds of conditions, what kind of flow conditions would we need to have? And so that's where these curves become extremely helpful. And so we were just playing around with different ranges in terms of where has the lake been, if we are able to get the lake back up. I guess I'm an optimist that we can do that, hopefully. If we did, what would that mean for salinity management? If the lake doesn't come back, if we stay where we've been, how do we make some of these decisions as to how to adjust that berm? How do we know when we might be getting into a problem before we are in a problem? And I think that's the beauty of these curves, is that really helps us understand better what could happen if the lake level changes or as the salt mass changes. But I think the key question, and I don't know that we need, I guess the curves aren't as critical in terms of a decision at this point, but I think this is just another evolution of the curves that Christine has been showing us. And want to move toward having a set of curves that we can incorporate into a salinity management plan and a comprehensive management plan for the lake. And so that the comprehensive management plan, the draft won't be done until this fall, but I don't want to wait until August to have.
And another thing that we're attempting to do with this management plan is to have this be something that can adapt as we learn more and refine these things, because we need to update our plans every 10 years. And to think that we're not going to have any like really substantial information that would change how we understand this is tough. So I think the things that we're going to like there's going to be something that gets printed, right? That's like static, and it only gets updated every 10 years. And in my mind, that's going to be like the elevation matrix and this salinity matrix. Like, here's where we want to be. But tools like this, where we're talking about, being able to predict and understand how we modify those, I don't anticipate having that be like an official, part of the plan that gets published. Those will be tools that we'll have available that are more interactive. But we intend to have a website component of this, where folks can come in and see like the current state of the lake, what we're doing at different salinity thresholds or elevation thresholds, and then we would use tools like this and try to create that as like an adaptive tool for how we manage salinity moving forward.
Why then would you not incorporate it? I mean, it really kind of, these isomass curves kind of tell us everything.
I think we could reference, like, here was the isomass curve based off of the data we had at this time. But I think that, to Christine's point, like, this is new. This is only like a month and a half old with this information on here. I think these things are going to continue to evolve, and as we understand the deep brine layer better and can incorporate that into estimates as we, do X, Y, and Z, I think it's just freezing things in a point in time and not being able to touch that for 10 years. It costs like $400,000 plus. That's like actually old dollars. It's probably more like $600,000 in 2 years of process. Like, we have to do public meetings and open houses and, make drafts. And so I would like to have something that doesn't, the people know what we're doing, but continue to evolve and build on the knowledge we have and adapt. So,
but the dots tell us what the reality was. The graph tells us where our mass should be for a certain elevation to stay within what we've designed as being an optimal. So that graph is still very, very useful to incorporate.
So my vision on that is that I think that you're right. I think we can still reference those things and say for this salt mass and this elevation, this is the salt mass we want to be at in the spring. Here's the max we want to be at in the fall, and kind of give those ranges. And that would be like, here's our goal, but the how to get there, the evolution of like understanding this information and how it gets applied, like how we estimate the salt mass, right? Like incorporate in the deep brine layer. I think those are all going to be something that we'll try to have a plan that continues to evolve and change to accommodate where we want to be at with that. But again, this is just the ideas we have now, and we're totally open for folks to criticize and give us.
So then the first thing you see, right, is if you go from where we are today to the middle of your target range, you get twice as much salt.
Yeah.
You better start planning now. You know, if that's
exactly.
really, if you want to be in the middle of your target range. Because that, it takes time. You ratchet towards those places.
Yeah.
You know?
Another alternative, which might make you feel more comfortable, Ben, is to actually remove the dots kind of show us where we are, but really the lines, the shaded boxes and the axes, they won't change. That's just like theoretical based on bathymetry and a calculation of salt mass. So that I see as being pretty fixed. It's just how we lay over the data.
So I suppose my point is that that's where we need to decide how we use this new tool and how it gets implemented into the plan. Is like, what is static? What do we think is not going to change? And then where are the areas where we're still refining it, and how we're actually going to implement that. So I think that like this body, we all talked about having a salinity management plan and like how we're going to do that. I see this isomass curve and these salt balances as being like the tool. So, but it's going to be new. So if we think we can like nail it the first time, we could certainly like append that into our plan, have that be the plan. But if we wanted to give some flexibility to be able to continue to adapt, I think we can reference like those curves, but maybe figure out how we, refine later on or continue to evolve on like how we actually estimate the salt mass, whether we're incorporating that value paradigm of like the deep brine layer, where that interface with the deep brine layer is to better refine. I think those are all things we haven't considered.
I mean, the curves are not going to change unless the bathymetry changes. This is straightforward.
Christy, I also have another question. Is it really possible that we would ever have 4 billion tons of salt in the South Arm, or is that just like the trajectory of?
Probably not.
Okay.
I was just feeling flex.
Yeah, just like okay.
But because I think Andrew might be talking about, but I think the Great Lake wide, it's like 4.5 billion tons.
Yes.
More than
I think it's higher than that. But yes.
So that may be
we
like,
can-
we're going to publish, and that's maybe another thing we want to consider is like, where does that actually top out? Does that curve continue that?
That's a great one.
I think the curves do communicate the complexity, as Scott said, of steering this giant ship where we want it to go. It also shows the interactivity between level, volume, mass, everything else. So, yeah, I think some way I think it becomes a tool, and maybe you don't put the dots on it, but publish the graph or something. But I think it's very valuable.
I think to your point though, and just in the last month, we were talking about, okay, well, how do we calculate the dot that's on here? And then I think what you just mentioned is that the salt mass over the last couple of years, several years, we haven't had a deep brine layer. And so we've been in a paradigm without a deep brine layer. But if the lake comes up and we start to import water from the North Arm again, we may see a deep brine layer. So how does that get incorporated into these curves? That might change these curves. And so I think if there's anything that I think we can look at over the last 10 years is that we keep learning a lot, and things keep changing, and so how can we, I think we want the science to keep pushing forward, and I guess we got to figure out how do we create a static or a document that balances.
If you look at our old elevation matrix, there were a lot of things in there that indicated health that honestly, like when you start to talk about microbial ledge, brine flies, brine shrimp, all of these, it's definitely not tied to the lake elevation solely, right? Like you have to have this. And so I think that's where we were kind of like, man, we're kind of missing the mark on how we tie in the salinity to the elevation matrix. And so our attempt here is, again, taking your curves and applying them to those elevations. But I think, again, the dots are like what make me uneasy is that, you know, the historic data, I think there's a lot of different ways you can interpret that, and that dot can move based on how you apply it, right?
These are actually just measurements. I just plotted a smattering of measurements. So it's nothing, there's no real interpretive.
But you wouldn't have like the deep brine layer represented, for example, right?
Yeah, I did
Like,
exclude this, yeah.
and I think that's like partly what I'm thinking is the challenge of this is that I think again, the salinity value is the day-to-day health, right? But the salinity or the mass is like how we're going to manage that in the future. And I think we have to consider the deep brine layer because, you know, if we were to like seal up the berm or you get the wave action, that eventually is going to mix. And so we're not going to lose that, but it's not represented on here. So like when Christine does her salt mass forecast and the elevation forecast and everything, like I think my opinion is that we would want to understand how much of that is, you know, accounting for the deep brine layer. We're going to exclude that. Those are things that are to be determined. And maybe we'll have that done by the time we publish our plan, but I think we want to try to understand, like, course correct if we're not getting it right. So
yeah.
Well, why don't we walk through the process of coming up with those numbers? Because I think that gets into how do we incorporate the deep, and how do we incorporate the different spatial locations, the depths?
And I will say, I did one iteration here where I was like, okay, can I just shift the lines or we were thinking a thick line to represent some range of masses for with and without a DBL. And it kind of just got really wonky. And so again, working with Scott, what we kind of landed was the lines aren't going to change. The mass is the mass computed with elevation and theoretical salinity. But what we can do is shift the dots to include the DBL when it's appropriate, and then look at and basically try to figure out a way to plot it such that we can visually see the magnitude of that change when there's a DBL and we account for all of that mass. So that's kind of the next step we'll take, and we'll certainly update everybody. But yeah, we're definitely thinking about these. Yeah. All right, so let's jump into the next phase, next step. So as Jeff mentioned, we're just trying to understand what kind of a representative upper brine layer salinity value would be each month, given the data that we have. And so I'll just remind folks of the monitoring network that, again, GSLEP is an integral part of. They visit 4 sites in the South Arm each month: 2565, 2267, 2767, and 3510. At our deep sites, 3510 and 2565, we have 3 water samples collected, 1.5 meter below the surface, 1 3 meters below the surface, and 1.5 meter above bottom. And then at our shallow sites, kind of near the mountain inflows, near at 2267, we sample at 0.5 meters below surface and 0.5 meter above bottom, which ends up being 2 to 3 meters below the surface. Site 2767 is too shallow to get a deep sample, so we just get a 0.5 meter below surface sample there. So just to orient you of the data we're working with each month, we have 9 measurements of salinity from 4 sites at varying depths. And so the question is, how do we take these values and come up with a monthly representative salinity value that we can all agree on that's representative of the upper brine? And so I just did a very simple approach, and I said, I'm going to calculate the mean salinity using all 9 values, and then I'm going to kind of incrementally remove various samples. So I removed every single sample and just recalculated the mean to see the effect. So that's kind of these from this green kind of shading through the blue purple. So, and then I said, what if I removed all the deep samples? What if I removed all the samples except for 2565 and 3510 shallow? What if I removed 2267 shallow, which is our site at the Bear River, as well as the deep? So just kind of playing with different configurations to see the effect on an annual computer, a monthly computed value. I also threw in the monthly maximum. What if we just took the maximum value each month and then calculated an upper brine layer volume weighted value, which I'll go through later how we calculated that. But this is just the range of monthly salinity values you would get. Most of them are, again, they're a mean based on some kind of conglomeration of samples. And I use data from April 2023 to the present to do all of that. So, and then at the bottom, these blue numbers just show you the range in salinity values you get each month, just from a computation of all of those. You tend to see a greater range in spring months, as you might expect, conditions are more or less well mixed during those conditions. So you get more variability, and how you compute the mean really matters. How you compute a monthly value really matters. More, if you get into late fall or early winter, the values tend to compress. You get a lower range. For example, in November of 2023, looking at 3 gram per liter range, no matter how you calculate the mean. So this was just kind of a simple way of exploring the effect of different ways of computing a monthly value, given the data set we have. This is the same plot, except I'm calculating a relative percent difference from using all the samples we have, just to give you some idea of, we might range by as much as 7% from using all the sample salinities we have, or it might be as low as 1.4%, where we get these different ranges, just to just try and orient ourselves around, does it really matter? Yes, it does. There's spread, and we can refine this to best meet the needs of the various purposes that this value will be used for. This box plot is just summarizing those distributions I just showed on the previous plot. So I kind of binned these. So I'm basically plotting relative percent difference, again, a monthly mean computed from a subset of data to using all of the values, all the samples in the month. In this green binned box, I'm removing combinations of different samples each month. So for example, removing our 2267 shallow, which usually skews quite low, then it biases the monthly value. So if I remove that and I remove our samples, here's kind of the effect it has relative to using all the samples available. If we just look at our sites in Carrington and Gilbert Bay, our deep sites and the shallow samples, you can see it skews a bit higher than using all the salinity values we have each month. If we remove all deep samples, then our monthly value is lower, as you might expect, than including those, because they tend to skew slightly higher. If I increment, this purple box is just the incremental, like what if I just remove a sample one by one and see the effect? Really, it's quite minimal. If you remove any sample of our 9 sample set, except for this 2267 shallow set. When I remove that sample, then the monthly salinities increase, because again, that site is usually more dilute and it skews the value lower. And then you can see the monthly maximum value is much higher. And then an upper brine layer with volume weighted value is kind of comparable to a 9 sample mean. So some take homes here. Obviously, using the maximum salinity each month generates the greatest deviation from using a mean of all samples on the order of 0 to 13% higher value. If our mean monthly salinity value would increase in the situations where we remove our 2267 shallow site, where we remove 2267 shallow and our deep samples, and in the case where we remove all samples except for our shallow samples at 2565 and 3510. Again, just to kind of illustrate the effect of removing different samples on a monthly value. And then the monthly value would decrease if we remove our deep samples. So just a bit of orientation. And I don't know the best value, but here's how things change. And then I'll just kind of close by showing you how the volume weighted salinity, the upper brine layer volume weighted salinity is computed. And this is really mirrors how I compute the salt masses and a volume weighted south arm salinity value. But basically I'm taking the top 5 meters of the water column at any given time, and I'm slicing it into 2 layers. The top layer is 1 meter thick, and that includes our sample that is collected 1/2 meter above the bottom. And then the second layer goes from 1 meter below the surface to 5 meters below the surface. So it's this 4 meter length of the water column, and that's tied to the 3 meter sample that is collected. So I can tie a volume of this layer with the salinity value that is collected at 3 meter depth, and same with layer 1.
So this is what you're doing right now, Christine.
This
Currently, when you calculate these.
Well, it's similar. So when I do the south arm volume weighted, it's the same, except I include this deeper part. Okay. This upper brine is kind of for the purposes of exploring this monthly representative salinity value. So the upper brine layer volume is computed as, and I separate it into 2 different bays, so we can kind of consider the bathymetry, the differences in the bathymetry in both Gilbert and Carrington Bay. So I sliced the south arm into 2 bays, and then for each bays, I sum the volume in layer 1 with the layer in volume 2, with the volume in layer 2, and then the Carrington Bay would be Carrington Bay slice in the layer, the first layer, and then the volume in the second layer. And then for the salt mass, it's again essentially tying each of those layers and their volumes to the salinity measured in that layer and summing up those for each bay. And in the end, you end up with we've got our volumes, some of volumes in the upper brine, some of masses in the upper brine, and then the volume weighted concentration is the mass divided by the volume. And that's how that value is computed. And Jeff was sort of leaning, I think, toward this approach as maybe the most representative value. But I think that's what the discussion is for.
And I guess that's when I get input from you. I think over the years, like the USGS salt and water balance model used about depth average salinity value, and which wasn't necessarily representative of what brine shrimp see in the upper brine layer. And so there's, how can, the question was always, how can we model the salt and water in the lake, but have an idea of what the uses of the upper layers are really seeing? And so I think, I guess what my wish list would be, the data that GSLEP collects, goes to USGS, it goes into NWIS, and, could we have a script that then scrapes that data and comes up with a value that we can then post on a curve to say, here's where we are today. And so we were just talking through all the different variables. We haven't had a deep brine layer, and so we can do a full volume weighted salinity estimate across the entire depth. But if and as we start to see a deep brine layer start to emerge again, what do we do? And so that's, I think this is kind of the straw man of, this is the data that is currently being collected, and how can we use the data that's currently being collected and reported to come up with a value that's meaningful for managing the resources we have.
It's hard to argue against a volume weighted, right? I mean, that's in my opinion, unless you would be able to, through history, find some salinity points that you could average that would get you close to that volume. To me, it's hard to argue against. What about publishing 2 different salinities, one with and one without the deep brine layer? Because the one without tells us today, where we are and how that's affecting the biota. The one with the deep brine layer tells us where that could go, because ultimately that deep brine layer will dissipate in the upper brine. How long it will take? A year, couple of years. We've seen that in history as well.
Volume weighted, like as it dissipates, the volume weighted in the upper brine would reflect any dissipation of the deep brine layer, right? So like if you're doing this as a monthly value, it would represent that as it gets mixed. So maybe it's not that big of a deal to deep brine layer. And you just say that, like you say it up front, right? Like you say, this is not representative of the bottom 5 meters because these conditions can't exist. So we're worried about these existing conditions. I don't know. It is a complex.
So Ben, I mean, one thing I think is the upper brine layer, the above 4 or 5 meters, is the photic zone in the south arm where you have pelagic ecosystems. And you are managing that in a different way than the salt mass, which takes a longer time to move and course correct. And that's where I think Thomas, I agree, 2 numbers is useful, but it's used for different things.
Well, and it's like what gets published though. I think that we really got to be careful about not confusing people too much. I think already like people can barely, the general public, lawmakers, other people can barely distinguish between like percentage and grams per liter. So if we start adding in salt mass and then, this is what it's like with the deep brine layer and not, our team here will get it, but then who else is using it?
Kyle had to
So maybe not publishing that second data, but I think it's worthwhile to keep both with and without the brine layer. Because when you think about the position in like 565 in Carrington Bay, it's on that kind of southern periphery of that deep brine layer pool. So we could actually have deep brine layer pool in Carrington Bay, but we are not capturing a 2565. And we're starting to see that it smelled like brine layer, but it doesn't look like brine layer. And that's that WCFS that's coming back. So it exists, but we're not capturing it yet.
Yeah, if you really want to elucidate what's in the deep brine layer, you're going to need to use the deeper site in 2565. It's not deep enough to capture that, and that brine layer salinity tends to increase as you get towards the bottom. It represents an increasingly smaller amount of volume, so it may not make much of a difference on the overall salt mass. And what we've generally seen over the years is that, you know, it's 10% or so of salt down there, but it's mainly it's a vector of moving salt from the north arm into the upper layer, so it never amounts to an enormous amount when it's only confined to that northwest basin. But if you do want to try to capture it, probably be better to use a deeper site for that.
Bill, have your hand up.
Yeah, I like this representation for the upper brine. If, in my opinion, if you want more information about what's happening deeper, I think providing the mass that's represented down there is more useful, so that you'd have three things. You have, in Christine's calculation, the mass in the upper brine, then the concentration or the salinity in the upper brine, and then the mass below. And just that gives you a sense of, well, how much is there? What percent of the upper brine mass is it? And not do an overall salinity, because that's perspective. That's if it all mixes, and it may or may not mix.
Yeah, I guess this was the challenge. Like Christine started looking at, what if it's 2267 at some times of the year is not representative of the South Arm because it's heavily influenced by the Bear River. So how do you, aside from somebody like Christine who's can make an estimated, an educated judgment on, I'm going to pull that point out for this month, that's not representative of the lake. And then if and when we have deep brine layers, I think, Bill, that was one of the things we were talking about is too, I think you're right, is if we know the mass of the upper brine layer, we know the overall mass, we know the salinity of the upper brine layer, that at least helps us with some of the management assessments that are being done. I think some of the management decisions, like Scott, you said, we can't change the mass on a dime. That's months, if not years, to be able to adjust that. And so, but keeping an eye on the mass, and I mean, these are all data points that I think are helpful for people like on this committee who understand what's going on. But for the public, they're just going to be very rapidly confused by what we're talking about. And so that's, I guess it's something we thought was important for the committee to start considering. I think here's an approach that seemed to make sense. And I think as we go forward, I think it's something that we should think about and improve upon if we need to. But I guess we wanted to get this conversation because I think, just with the new rule from DWQ on what's the salinity, we need to have a number for the upper that we managed to. We need numbers for a flow control structure. We need numbers for a comprehensive management plan. We need a number that is easily understandable.
Can we go back to the previous graph where you were pulling out one at a time, So the purple box is where you're pulling out one site every time.
One sample at a time, one
One
out of our
sample at
nine.
a time. And that leftmost is
This,
the one that changes
that's our,
somewhat significant.
that's our 2267 shallow.
Pull that one out and it does change quite a bit. What's the percentage change?
I think the median value is around less than 1%. These quantiles are maybe,
And you suggest we go with the median value? Median value? Because if it's less than 1%,
Right,
why bother?
right. The variability isn't a ton.
It would make the SOP really complicated during this period of time. With spring runoff, we pull out sample X or Y, just leave it in.
Yeah, I think the alternative is using the upper brine layer with the volume weighted value where it all kind of gets smoothed. Because I think, yeah, what I see here is that, yes, 2267 shallow sample has an effect on a monthly value. It has a, it has a lot of sway in the final number, but it's still the South Farm. And like, what's hard about it is there's a bunch of fresh water coming in, and it's really difficult to delineate what is the surface area or the volumetric influence of that. It might be representative of a large area of the South Farm. And so I like the alternative where we use as much of the data as we can. And maybe this is a way to incorporate incorporate the 2267 shallow value and still kind of get something that's a little more smooth or representative.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, just because it skews it doesn't mean we should throw it out. I actually, I just still
But
the lake.
when you say excuse it 1%, meaning if we have 100 PPT, it skews it by 1 PPT overall. Is that what you mean by 1%?
That's a good question. It's just skewing the monthly estimate of salinity relative to a 9 sample. So yes, it would be in gram per liter, 1% difference.
1 gram per liter.
At
100.
1% difference in the gram. No, I know. 1% difference. What would it
Or
be?
10 grams per liter. No, I'm
Yeah.
trying to understand.
Yeah,
Is
no,
it
it's
1
like
gram per
a-
liter or 10 grams per liter?
Difference.
Because if
It's
it's
one.
1.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's two philosophical approaches, right? One is you're data agnostic. You include everything because it's undersample. You just say that's real data. Or you say there's heterogeneity, or volume weighted to get a calculated salinity. The drawback of that is it's not a measurement. It's not a real value, right? And that's unattractive in some ways because the median is actually a measurement you made. Unlike the mean, right, is not a measurement you made. You don't know how to weight those. So, I mean, the volume weighting deals with that heterogeneity of the system, but it's not a real value, right? And if you just are agnostic and you just take the median or the mean even, the problem with the mean is the same thing as volume. It's not a measured value.
But the big picture here is that all those individual medians are very close to the volume weighted average.
Yes.
And so it is a real number in the sense it's not far off any of those medians at all.
Correct.
With the shallow sample too, I mean, aren't we potentially losing some of that through the breach anyway, like at 2267? Like, couldn't that also be excluded for the purpose of it kind of short circuiting? And we know that's potentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, right.
But the other side is you got to look at that water's coming into the South Arm, and that's going to be reflected in your salinity measure the next month. So while it's dropping this month and skewing it low, well, that water is still going to be in the system somewhere, whether it's South Arm or North Arm.
And it's probably reflected in the discharge.
So the drainage should be reflected in the next sample.
It doesn't make a big difference.
Right. And yeah, I think that's
Less than 1%.
why wouldn't we lose the data? Because this data is
And I think that was where we were heading with this, that, we have a lot of great data and it's really hard to justify eliminating data for some times and not the others. And so we're trying to come up with a consistent method where we, in this case, we are excluding those deep points consistently. We're including all of the upper samples. And as we can see here, is that when we do that, I think, we're by consistently using the same method, we're able to incorporate that heterogeneity of that. So, Andrew?
I mean, I think I'd be more concerned if it's skewed the salt load, the salt mass significantly. But that's only reflected in the top half meter, right? Total salt, so,
Top medium. Half is the midpoint.
oh, half is the midpoint. Oh, so top medium.
So I
Okay.
think, I mean, we're just presenting this to you today, so there's a lot to think about, obviously, and especially get into the statistics and what did these all mean? But I think what we wanted to do is introduce this to you. I forwarded these slides to the committee members. If anybody else wants to see them, send them to you as well. But I think it's something to think about and try to wrap our brains around. And you know, the goal, I think, and I guess I try to always come back to, well, what is our goal here? Is, you know, we want to have a metric that the public, you know, policymakers can wrap their brains around and understand where are we today. And we still, I think we all understand that there are a lot of discrete data points that go to this, and they all mean something. And so that's something that we can still do. But how can we try to distill this into something that's easy for people to understand and to be able to use? And so I think the discussion has been great. I know Kyle and then Joe. I know we're at the top of the hour here. Go ahead, Kyle. Oh, you're good? Joe.
I apologize, Jeff and Christine, if I missed it, but I think somebody said, you know, well, if you're throwing out sort of 10% of the mass by excluding the deep brine layer, is that right, Christine, or is there would you have a different assumption?
The deep brine layer, when it's present, we found that it represents about 12 on central tendency median value to about 12% of the total South Arm salt mass.
12%. Okay. Okay, thank you.
It does going off the median or excluding it, does that also have any effect on like how we look at the trends and the history? I mean, if we start doing it differently now, what does that do to how we correlate that to the past? I mean,
if we start,
well, I mean, like if we just start computing this off the median today, or say that we just say, you know, it's good enough to just go off the average and we're going to disregard, you know, that change because it's only 1%. Does the data start to look different, even though you're getting the same values based on what we've done in the past? I'm just trying to think of like what other touch points changing something like this would have now, and maybe I'm not.
Oh, that's a great.
No, what methodology did we use in the past?
well, I
Did
mean,
we use the integrated salinity?
typically I just share raw values. I just share measured salinity values. So it's never really been an integrated representative South Arm salinity value for a time step.
Because to me, the easiest thing, or no, maybe not the easiest, because maybe it's complicated, but like if we can keep it consistent with the way we've collected data in the past, I think there's some value to that.
Mhm.
Especially if it's only going to change things 1% or maybe, you know, not substantively change something in the future.
Season matters on the
Right.
falls when the weight's homogeneous. That's not going to be much of a difference. Spring runoff 2267
That's where it
really
Yeah.
no longer represents a lot of the other surface points on the lake, and that's when you have to consider its influence more.
Just throwing that out as another.
I think it's important because I know when the lake was a lot deeper, we were using that depth weighted average salinity, at least in the models. I don't know what, you know, what did Wally Quinn use on his graphs? I don't know.
So let's make it a three-dimensional graph.
So I think it's an important question to look at and to consider, you know, how does this relate to what's been tracked in the literature in the past? But anyway, I think we're at the top of the hour here. Thank you, Christine. She put a lot of work into this, and so I think it's something to think about. And I guess if you have any comments afterwards, you know, please let Christine know or me know. And I think we want to try to move this forward and make sure we've got something that the committee can eventually recommend as something that forestry, that maybe it's on the hydro mapper or somewhere like that, where people can access the information easier than trying to decipher through endless all the different sample sites. But So the last thing I wanted to ask, I think our next scheduled meeting is June 26th, the fourth Thursday of the month. Is there a need to meet before then? Anybody think? We're going to see how the runoff happens.
I might just say, based on where we're at with the elevation matrix and what we're doing with that, there may be, maybe it's not an actual salinity committee meeting, but if anybody has interest in participating in that, that might be a place to get a little bit of progress before we come back to the committee. So maybe that's something we can work on, Jeff. So see who, if anybody wants to participate. Yeah, do it something else.
So we'll, I'll send some emails out. You can kind of self-select if you want to participate or not. You can ignore my email, or if you want to, please respond. But I think, you know, I mean, the brain trust here is incredible, and that I think is critical to move this forward. So, but for now, we'll plan on June 26th as the next meeting. And
Andrew was just about to volunteer. I saw him.
No, sorry, I'm still thinking about between 7 and 6.
Oh, that wasn't what you heard.
We just need to take a day and run a bunch of train sets, take a bunch of surface samples, see what the variability is. We have for 2 days. Routine 9 sites. So if you want some idea of that from those, give me a date range. I might be able to let you know.
Andrew's looking for a field day.
Well, we don't take them out on the day. I think those are important questions. Is the hair? Great. Well, with that, I guess I'll take a motion to adjourn. And I see nodding heads, so we are adjourned.